2023, ChatGPT had kind of already came out. I suppose the world was going a little bit crazy.
LLMs and generative AI text is rooted in statistics.
All the chief execs across the world now are kind of like hell-bent on this AI thing.
It doesn't have to solve everything because there's a lot that's practical. That's the exciting and frustrating part. Some parts of that might be agentic in nature because there's totally a way to kind of build that.
It seems to me like there must be some degree of tension occurring.
But that doesn't necessarily mean the overall thing is agentic. Without having a clear, tangible ROI at the other end of whatever you're doing, is bound to fail.
I can imagine that they really want to get their hands on this kind of stuff.
They're phenomenal.
Separating signal from noise.
And no matter what the industry likes to talk about, guardrails and all those things, it's a deceitful concept.
This episode of VUX World is brought to you by NLX. NLX is the enterprise conversational AI platform that enables some of the world's most admired brands to build and manage chat, voice, and multimodal applications at scale. So if you are looking for a platform to power all of your conversational automation initiatives, you're looking for something that's enterprise grade, something that gives you the flexibility and control to create the kind of experiences that you know your customers need, then check out NLX. You can find out more at nlx.ai. That's nlx.ai. Thank you, NLX, for sponsoring VUX World. The following then is a conversation with Andrei Papancea, who is the CEO and co-founder of NLX, funnily enough. And this conversation is one for those that are looking for an incredibly pragmatic, realistic, down-to-earth perspective on the value of generative AI and AI more broadly for enterprises. You're probably drinking from the AI agent fire hose right now. And rather than just throwing everything at AI agents, whatever that means, in an effort to be cool and, say to your CEO that you're doing the right thing, and maybe it's to prevent yourself from just needlessly burning a load of greenhouse gases on this technology, maybe it's best that you start from the perspective of finding what the problem is that you're trying to solve, and then figure out what the technology requirements are that will have you solve that problem. And if you took that approach, you might find some very specific areas for AI, for generative AI, maybe if you want to call it agentic AI, that will really actually help you solve problems and contribute to the business outcomes that you're trying to achieve. That essentially is this conversation in a nutshell. Andrei's perspectives are probably some of the most clear and some of the most realistic and some of the most grounded perspectives that you'll hear from a company or a founder of a company that sells AI technologies. Most of the time, the founders of these kind of companies want to shout from the rooftops about how fantastic their technology is and how great generative AI is and how ultimately everything's going to be AI agents. And I'm not looking at anyone in particular, but that's generally the narrative from especially the big tech companies. Andrei's perspective is very enlightening because it's clear-cut, it's really down to earth, it's really practical, and you're going to learn a hell of a lot from this conversation. So if you are looking at ways in which you can leverage generative AI effectively, properly, reliably, in a way that's going to help you, this is a conversation worth paying attention to. Without further ado, this is Andrei Papancea on VUX World. All right, hello, Andrei Papancea. Welcome back to VUX World for the fourth time that we've tried this intro, but for the second time on VUX World. Are you hearing me?
Excited to be back, Kane.
Good.
Success.
Oh, for those tuning in, we've had a bit of an issue trying to get this audio working for some strange reason. I don't know why, but here we are again. Here we are. Thank you so much for joining me. I don't suppose you remember or can recall the last time you were on the podcast. Do you know when it was?
Oof, that must have been 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Does that feel right?
It was July 2023.
Feels like eons ago.
It does, doesn't it? It feels like a long time ago. 2023, ChatGPT had kind of already came out. I suppose the world was going a little bit crazy, starting to figure out kind of like, what it's good for, what it's not so good for, this, that, and the other. what's been the change at NLX in that time from 2023? Sounds like a lifetime ago. Wasn't that long ago necessarily, but what's kind of been changing in your world then? What developments are you seeing?
I mean, I feel there's something new every day. For the last 2 years, I think, yeah, it's been quite a journey. I mean, just kind of reflecting on it. On one hand, we've never strayed away from our mission, just to enable organizations to build phenomenal user experiences for their customers. With all the innovation that's obviously impacted the space in the last few years, we've supercharged our platform. And I think it's been cool to watch the just market as a whole. Because I would say we could target just the conversational AI space, but I think the market as a whole just consume this innovation, experiment a lot, see what works, what doesn't. I don't think the market's fully realized what the true practical potential of all the AI years is, but we've been, riding on the coattails of being at the intersection of practicality and hype for a while at NLX, and been a lot of goodness that came out of it. I mean, our customers, I mean, all companies nowadays, or all serious companies, are looking at leveraging these technologies in some capacity, and it's been fun to partner with the most inspiring brands to basically co-innovate. It's fun to try to push the boundaries where it's not like you're just at the cutting edge. The market itself is constantly at the cutting edge. So
yeah,
it's been a fun ride.
Good. And one of the things that I like about kind of you and NLX is that I always think that, I was talking to the team about this the other day, I always think that a company ends up in some way being some kind of reflection of the founders, whether or not that's intentional or otherwise. It's like, I don't think you can kind of help embody certain values or whatever into the company. They tend to reflect the person that creates them. And there's a few companies out at the moment that have been doing this for a long time. NLX is one of them. And a few people kind of, at the helm of those companies that have got their heads switched on, if you know what I'm saying. Like some of the newer school, and I won't name names, but some of the newer school sort of like pure Gen AI type of platforms are kind of like, trying, but very much evangelical about everything being generative AI. And you're one of those characters who is kind of seems to be very much down to earth about it all, which is on the one hand appreciative of the huge potential and the value and the problems it can solve, but on the other hand very much practical. You've mentioned that word a couple of times already in just that opening statement, that it's kind of all about figuring out how to actually make it do something useful that's going to contribute to the goals that you're trying to achieve, as opposed to let's just kind of use the technology. So in that kind of vein, I think I hopefully got it right in terms of how you are thinking about this, but how do you approach separating signal from noise at NLX? Because you're one of the people in the industry who I imagine that every day, every time there's an announcement, people are sending you stuff. Check out this. You've probably got people internally. What are we going to do about this? And it's kind of like you're going to get a lot of noise coming your way. So how do you approach separating signal from noise and translating that into something that's going to be actually useful for NLX and customers?
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind feedback. I don't take that lightly. I genuinely appreciate it. We're pretty relentless about just not just in how we build product, but also in how we engage with customers and prospective customers alike to work on real problems. And I was just on a panel yesterday. Amazon hosted it in New York, and it was really cool. I got like a slew of questions after the fact, and people are trying to just sort of figure out how do do you navigate the space that is so rapidly moving, and how do you keep track with all the different things? And the short answer is you don't have to keep track with all of the different things, at least not in the level of depth that some people might think. Because if you're working real problems, as you sort of like deconstruct, like, because, you know, whenever you have a big problem, you have to break it down in order to solve it. And then those individual problems that need to be solved would inadvertently push you to figure out what the state of the art or the cutting edge thing is. And if it's not, how do you innovate to introduce it, to address such problem? And I find that that's unintuitive for many in the market, because on one hand, it could be that maybe they don't understand some of the facets of the technology, and you have all these tools. They progress very rapidly, and people feel like they have to keep up with every single element of it. But then there's the other element where doing any sort of work in this space without having a clear, tangible ROI at the other end of whatever you're doing is bound to fail. And we do this a lot with prospective customers who our existing customers are used to our way of working, and they sort of lend themselves to the process, let's call it, right? Because there's the technology piece, and then oftentimes they see us as advisors for how to innovate, which is a fun place to be in. But then there's the other part where with prospective customers, they naturally, by the nature of what the market's buzzing around, might be pursuing something that they don't always have a clear sense of why they're pursuing it. Like, just to use the buzzword of agentic AI, like 99% of people can't truly define, or they don't have a good definition of what that means to them or otherwise. It's like, well, what's the point of, trying to go down the road of just let's play around with buzzwords and mess around if you don't have a clear sense of what you're trying to solve? And that of course applies beyond the space or the space that we operate in, right? It's just like a general principle. It's like, work the problem. Like, what are you trying to do? It's like, are you trying to increase revenue? Are you trying to be more operationally efficient? Are you trying to whatever it is? And then when you work backwards from that, I really admire Amazon's leadership principle in this regard. Like, I find that that concept of working backwards just applies everywhere. So whoever's listening, just give it a shot if you haven't, or read up on it. It's pretty easy to apply, because it allows you to sort of do away with preconceptions about how something should be solved, and instead you immerse yourself with the problem, and then work backwards from it and figure out what might help you drive to a solution. And maybe not so coincidentally, you'll end up finding out that there's not one thing that leads to that solution. So like, it's not that, oh no, you shouldn't be using XYZ tools, so you shouldn't be using generative AI or LLMs. Quite the opposite. No, they're phenomenal tools to your earlier point. But just because something exists doesn't mean it solves all the problems, or that it should be applied everywhere. Like, I feel a lot of what's happening in the AI space, more broadly speaking, especially if we're surrounding it around the conversational AI, which, yes, by the way, it involves agentic. Agentic AI falls under that bucket. Most companies are just driving greenhouse gas emissions up. Like, they're not really driving any meaningful value. And it's because they're disconnected from the real problem. It's never been easier to get to quick, impressive prototypes in this space than it is today. Or you can build phenomenal things in like literally seconds. But then the gap between prototype or pilot and production has remained largely the same.
Yeah.
Because the majority of the effort to actually take something to production and scale it has remained largely unchanged. The complexities of enterprises or like, whatever the organizations that ultimately, from a world market standpoint end up driving value for, they're still equally complex. Just because LLMs are around and you can prompt things and the AI will basically generate some stuff that you can make use of and make some operations more efficient. It doesn't take away from the complexity of the real world.
How do you then, you mentioned that the whole point is to start with the problem and work backwards. And I think also Apple have had a similar kind of philosophy, that infamous kind of keynote from Steve Jobs, which was like, you have to start with the experience and then work back to the technology. It's a really great kind of notion, which I think often gets lost in this space as well, because I don't think actually that people are starting with the experience and working back to the technology. I think very much everybody is beginning with the technology, figuring out how to make it work and throwing stuff out there that, technically speaking, on the face of it seems as though it does kind of work, but there's a complete absence of concentration on the user experience. The pain point that I kind of point out a lot is, I call it the full stop problem of retrieval augmented generation, which is that when you have a chatbot that you want to replace the NLU, and often it's the case of replacing that with RAG for some reason, everything gets sent to the RAG model and all it does is answer questions. And it doesn't really understand what you're actually talking about. So if you're asking questions that are in a sales-related nature, it doesn't really know that what you need to do next is book an appointment. It kind of just keeps on asking you questions until you tell it, I want to book an appointment. It just doesn't have an awareness of the actual conversation. But maybe we can get into that and some of the kind of ways in which this has been applied. But I'm curious about that kind of starting with the problem and working backwards. In your view, what kind of problems do you see in the work that you're doing? And obviously, I know that you've got some product announcements coming soon, so I'm not asking you to share any kind of like secrets around that. But from the work you've been doing so far, where do you see generative AI in particular playing a role that does add value? So what problems in the enterprise conversational AI space do you think that generative AI does genuinely solve or can genuinely solve?
Well, I'll take that and maybe add a little twist to it. Let's call them large language models. And I'll emphasize where pure generative AI, like text or imagery or whatever, is truly valuable and practical, and where I think the market still trying to sort out how to best deploy it. But if I go a little bit a higher level and just call it LLMs, and we stay within language for a second. LLMs are practical across the full spectrum of an enterprise, whether customer facing or all the way to back office. So I'll just kind of put that flat out. Great tools. For one, just using them in the context of better intent identification, especially if we're talking customer facing, they're phenomenal. I mean, again, the difference between if you send the utterance cancel flight or canceled, so ed at the end, flight, to a traditional NLP engine, and it will end up with the same conclusion, that it's probably just you want to cancel your flight, right? Versus an LLM that will see through the semantics and the very tiny nuance from a pure word or character entropy, and then understand that they're one of them is the intent to cancel a flight, the other one's the likely inadvertent reaction of a flight having been canceled and then requiring some other action, right? So basically, this is a super practical thing to solve with LLMs, and there's different ways to apply it. If you want to do embeddings or if you want to do pure generative AI text, you can get differences in performances and definitely a lot of practicality there. Where to now touch on generative AI in particular, and I'll stick with generative AI text for the purposes of my answer here. Use cases that tolerate the degree of imperfection that LLMs pose when used with the generative AI text function are fully practical today. So what I'm saying is, if a brand or organization that's trying to deploy these technologies is okay with the implications of generative AI text customer facing, great. They can use it there just as much as they can use it anywhere else. What I'm seeing with large brands is that, maybe not so surprisingly, they're very reticent to do that because, well, they have to protect their brand. And no matter what the industry likes to talk about, guardrails and all those things, it's a deceitful concept. Because for one, LLMs and generative AI text is rooted in statistics, which by definition are imperfect. So you're guaranteed an imperfect response. And guardrails is just another statistically rooted sort of model that you're applying to another probability, another statistical one. So you're absolutely guaranteed to get an imperfect answer back. Whereas I feel most folks who are not familiar with the inner workings of, machine learning, AI, statistics, etc., or just knowing that AI is rooted in statistics, I think they hear guardrails and they think it's like, oh, this is going to prevent this system from doing what I don't want it to do, which is 100% false. Now, if you're moving back office, there's a natural increase in tolerance for imperfection. Now, that tolerance for imperfection might be lower if you're talking applying generative AI to an HR function just by the legal implications that they might pose, versus you interacting with an internal IT system for replacing your laptop or whatever. There's all kinds of different mechanisms to sort of introduce value and create lift and drive a bunch of efficiency with generative AI in those types of scenarios. And it doesn't have to solve everything. Imagine it shaves a minute or two of an interaction, or you summarize a call post conversation or a chat or whatever, or you're doing RAG for some internal groups, right? It's okay if it makes a mistake every so often, as far as maybe you pointed to the documentation that likely contributed to the response, right? But the same things don't necessarily ring true customer facing. And the size of the organization or the nature of the organization that might push forward some of these systems, in some of the upcoming releases on just our digital presence, product, whatever, we're gonna we already wear our technology on our sleeves because if you interact with the NLX brand through phone calls, whatever, you try to reach out, we use our technology to power those. But say I put a generative AI chatbot on my website, or I'm posed to the decision whether to do that or not. It's fairly benign for an NLX to kind of put that on our website. Inadvertently, it opens it up to some level of imperfection, but we're a company that powers these types of experiences. So it makes sense that we experiment or we push the boundaries there. The same thing wouldn't apply for, a Fortune 500 company, right? Because their contract with their consumers or their users who might engage is different than one of a technology company sort of selling this class of technology to their customers, right? So I see a lot of practicality, just different degrees depending on the tolerance level for the brand that's looking to deploy the technology.
Definitely. And in terms of the sort of tolerance, am I understanding it correctly from your last sort of statement there, which is that the larger companies with more at stake, so big banks, big insurance companies, large healthcare companies, things like that, there's more at stake, one, because of the nature of the conversations. If I'm talking to you about my finances, then I do not want you to make a mistake. If I'm talking to you about my health, then I don't want you to make a mistake. So it's the treatment of the individual is important, but also the brand reputation could be more impactful if something big is to go wrong. So am I reading it correctly from your statement that there is more caution with those type of companies? And if that is the case, are you observing? It seems to me like there must be some degree of tension occurring because all the chief execs across the world now are kind of like hell-bent on this AI thing because the CEOs of the Salesforces of the world are telling them and OpenAI are telling them that it's going to be like the world-changing technology and everything's going to be agentic, and Satya Nadella's telling them all that their legacy infrastructure is going to be consumed by a big AI reasoning model that's going to do all of your kind of like business processing for you. So it's clear that there is interest in that kind of like upper management, kind of like senior sort of chief executive C-suite sort of level. And perhaps there's even interest at the practitioner level in terms of the people who are using the NLX technology in those organizations, designing experience and building stuff. I can imagine that they really want to get their hands on this kind of stuff. But then there's that bit in the middle, which is like, well, we don't want to be putting stuff out there that we can't guarantee, and our business process has to be the same every single time because we don't want to, mess up and get something wrong and that kind of thing. So, like, how are you observing businesses kind of like what finding congruence or like reconciling those things where on the one hand there's ultimate excitement and real keenness and eagerness. On the other hand, there is, hold on a minute, we don't want to get this wrong, and we don't know if we should. Yeah. How what are your thoughts on that kind of like conflict?
Well, I think there's a missing element on that list, which is the legal component. So ultimately, the types of organizations that you just kind of alluded to, there's a legal risk to that list. Yeah, there's the brand, the reputation. I mean, as an NLX, I'm the CEO and founder, right? Like I care about the reputation and brand exposure of my company. The legal risk to NLX, maybe I give, let's say I put a generative AI experience somewhere on our digital properties, and someone asks about pricing and it gives them an off answer because, again, that's how LLMs work. Sometimes they might give you the incorrect answer. If you use the generative AI text function, that's not the same as what happened to Air Canada, right? Where, and this was what, a year and a half ago? I don't even remember anymore. But basically, for those who are not familiar with it, right, they put the generative AI powered experience on one of their digital properties. I don't want to misquote, but I think it was their main website. Someone who was dealing with a death was looking up the bereavement policy. The bereavement policy was cited back to them incorrectly. Air Canada did not honor the bereavement policy as it was cited by the AI assistant and tried to make some ridiculous claims around basically the fact that the AI, it's its own entity, blah, 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 etc. I think they went to court. The traveler, rightfully so, won because, well, like the idea of just now we're calling these AI systems as basically a glorified autocomplete. Fantastic autocomplete, but glorified autocomplete is now like some entity that acts on its own. It's like, no, you take something forward, you should take responsibility for what you put forward to your consumers. And naturally, especially if we're talking publicly traded companies, irrespective of where they're publicly traded, like they have a legal exposure that's not the same for other types of organizations, right? So, in terms of the conflict. I think a lot of these leaders just end up grappling, or it comes back to like, well, what are you really trying to solve? To kind of use the buzzword of the day, right? Agentic AI. Like we've run a survey not too long ago, right? And it was quite interesting to see how many execs at organizations with, I think, like 5,000 or 10,000 plus employees or even larger. Basically, it's like they're like, oh, they're all going to have agentic AI, or many of them do. But then you go to these brands' experiences, and like at least because we also kind of like specifically fished for like customer facing, and many who do say they do that, they actually don't, right? So then I think there's this pursuit of trying to stay relevant by keeping up with the latest buzzwords and saying that you do it. But then they forget in the process, like, what are you really trying to solve with this? Because AI is not like a universal solution. Like none of these different individual technologies is what the ultimate goal of the organization is, right? Again, you're probably trying to save money, introduce some form of efficiency, improve user experience somewhere, save time, whatever that is. Unless it's tied to something like that, it probably doesn't make sense for you to do it. So yes, top down, boards everywhere. It's like you have to use AI, you have to do generative AI, you have to do agentic AI because they want to be able to communicate that to the market. But ultimately, I think the inflection point I see, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is things get productive when these leaders tasked with implementing these technologies allow themselves to take a step back and then ask themselves, like, what are they actually trying to solve? And once they have that, then we can, again, work backwards and say, great, you're trying to, let's say, drive automation in your call center. Perfect. Let's identify what the all reasons are. Like, do you have a particular KPI or goal to hit? Like, do you need to get to 10%, 30% net automation over whatever you're doing today? Great. Now, in order to do that, let's kind of work backwards from like, what's the state of all of these systems? Because oftentimes, like, I think you and I might have talked about this before. It's like, the challenge is not the AI technologies or, platforms like ours being able to enable the type of innovation and implementations that these companies can benefit from. It's like oftentimes they might not have their systems in order that are necessary to basically transact in a certain way, right? If I'm a bank and you want to automate replacing a card over the phone and you don't have enterprise systems or APIs accessible for the AI system to perform the card replacement, well, no amount of AI is going to solve that problem for you. And, just kind of, so when I mean working backwards, just lead with the goal or the problem that you're trying to address. And then if you go through that process in this manner, you'll unpack the individual smaller problems I need to solve. And some of those will be solved by certain classes of AI, others by others, or no AI at all. Because again, there's the universal problems existing in this world are not all addressable by AI. And that's okay. I think that's another important thing. I think a lot of the leaders and companies holistically operating in the market are realizing it's like, or they need to realize is that AI doesn't have to solve everything. And as far as you reach your goal, it doesn't matter. Like just focus on solving the problem that it's really the driver of all these other conversations. Because like I can't imagine like there's any executive out there whose company is like working like super smooth on the rails, like they're hyper efficient and they're like, oh yeah, let's just do this thing for the sake of it. It's like, no, everyone has inefficiencies, right? Whether small or big. So it's like, just ultimately it boils down to trying to solve some inefficiency. And that problem is never AI. That's not the problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I I published something. In fact, it was even this morning on LinkedIn, which was kind of like asking the question whether are we now kind of like in Gartner's hype cycle sliding down the pit of inflated expectations, which is that there was perhaps like back end of last year, beginning of this year, even still to some degree now, the real kind of like buzz around agentic AI. And I am a kind of like open-minded skeptic around agentic AI. I published in January what I think is a pretty good appraisal almost like a literature review, basically, of all of the different definitions of this stuff from all of the researchers that have been looking at this since the 70s, and picked out one of the definitions that was in there, which basically synthesized about 20 different definitions all into one really great statement that I think encapsulates what agentic AI is. And it's not what most people are talking about. It's essentially the ability to autonomously, as in not being given a goal, but in it being able to create its own goal, and then sensing within an environment, planning how to solve something, solving it or acting, and then learning from that and taking it back again. So again, there's another degree of autonomy. And so I have a bit of a kind of bee in my bonnet, which is about all this kind of rhetoric. But what's really interesting, as I've observed in the last probably couple of months, is that it seems to me, at least, as though everyone is now starting to come down to earth, because Microsoft has now changed the way that it talks about agents. It doesn't call them AI agents anymore. It calls them autonomous agents. So it's, as you said, AI might not be the solution all the time. Now it's autonomous agents, because that allows you to explore the potential of using other technologies, deterministic machine learning or whatever other things you might want to use. Google, in its definition, in its most recent video of one of its developer videos, which it did before, because this is referenced in the article, but Google's definition of agents are both non-deterministic and deterministic. Salesforce, that's been really kind of like, out there in terms of AI agents of the future, and it's all about AI agents. You look at the most recent announcements coming from the Agentforce platform, and it's now able to capture variables, which I can't believe it couldn't in the first place. And it's also enabling you to be able to use deterministic workflows. And it's like, well, what were you doing beforehand? So it seems to me as though we're kind of like realizing collectively that, yeah, fair enough, there is a whole bag of potential, and we've alluded to some of it. I think, classification is a great example. Dialogue management is a good example, dealing with the messiness of language, even supplementing an NLU with generative AI to maybe rephrase and reclassify and do bits like that, narrowly scoped areas where you can apply a real piece of value to optimize the output of something seems to me to be where the real sort of value is. And the more narrowly scoped it can be, maybe it's the more value you get, because maybe it's not, but it might be an accumulation of marginal gains, where if you can make your NLU a bit better, you can make your dialogue management a bit better, you can make your handover to the agents a little bit better, you can make their life a little bit easier to help them find information a bit better. It doesn't have to be this revolutionary AGI future thing. Or is it actually that it's finding its place in more narrowly scoped areas where it could be really, really, really beneficial, but maybe it's not doesn't have to be this big thing that it's kind of being built to be. I mean, I'm going on a bit of a ramble there. I don't really know where I'm going with that, but the sentiment is, it seems as though people are starting to realize that there needs to be some pragmatism, and the more narrowly focused you can find opportunities, the better the results you'll get. Would you concur with that?
100%. I mean, there's the other part where I'm glad you alluded to it, so I didn't have to say it myself. I'll just reinforce it. It's like the big guys, I think, have a responsibility to. I mean, well, let me walk that back a little bit, because the responsibility, sure, they have it, but do they always exercise it? Not really. I think they have an outsized megaphone, right, and voice in the market, and I can't possibly buy an argument where key leaders at those organizations who truly understand these technologies to have bought into some of that BS, right, and how they were positioning it. But it did, because it helps the stock price, but then the problem is, much like what the VC ecosystem does to the space, because they're basically hand in hand with what you mentioned. It's like they kind of think of some shiny toy, they remove practicality out of it, and then sometimes practicality is there, right? So I'm not trying to make the argument that there's no legs to whatever's hot in the market. There's clearly legs around AI, just not the way being invested in or positioned like that, then as you mentioned, that message is being calibrated by those as we speak. But it's like, if you're gonna shift the attention of everyone knowingly just for the sake of growth at all costs, especially if you have the resources or capacity to understand that something like that's not practical, then kind of sucks, right? Because like progress is stifled because of that type of behavior in the market, not because the technology doesn't have potential or there's not a lot of practical, really ROI driven things that you have today. I mean, let's think about how many companies coming out of Y Combinator for the last 2-3 years raise a lot of money, and then basically they get traction because there's a lot of demand and interest for experimentation in this market. But most of that traction just stays there. Churn is high, and basically, again, I'll go back to my greenhouse emission comment. It's like a lot of those use cases are just not tied to anything that truly drives ROI. So yeah, I mean, it's I'm also seeing the same trends that you alluded to, and then I'm excited that the market's starting to naturally calibrate and focus on what truly matters, which is practicality. Because ultimately, practicality is tied to driving value, driving results, and we live in a world that's driven by economics, right? Like you can't just like spend infinitely on something that doesn't drive value, because you'll deplete the resources that you have at your disposal. So I think it's just like a natural calibration of that. Now we'll see where the market goes from here. And I mean, in terms of our approach, as I mentioned, it's like we ground ourselves in terms of how we build product and take it to market, but also in how we engage with customers and push them and challenge them to work real problems. Like it's not unusual that we'll turn down work or projects that might have monetary component to it, but is not tied to a real ROI driven thing. Like experiments that do not have let's say at the end of the experiment, if you have like some concrete KPIs, great, that can technically just go to production. If it doesn't have that attribute, not something we pursue. And we're transparent with the customer in that regard, because what's the point of that? Like it's kind of, engage our team or deploy resources on both sides that are unlikely to drive anything interesting. So we on behalf of the company, we generally steer clear of that and try to work on problems that have real legs and just kind of a long tail stickiness.
It must be hard for you though, is it? Because when you have the marketing collateral of a very large, well-funded organization and all of the resources that go along with that, and they ultimately are responsible for creating the perceptions in the market. And some of them are more guilty than others. To be fair, I know you're Amazon partners, and Amazon actually is one of the companies that, if you look at their definition of agentic, is actually really sensible. And I don't see them really being responsible for a lot of noise. It's actually Amazon are one of the companies that do seem to have their head screwed on. But it's kind of like, it must put some pressure on you in some ways, because while all of this is going on, and all of the people we were talking about in terms of like leadership and all that lot who want this like ChatGPT, everything's agentic type of thing, give us computer use and operator, because that's what we're going to do. We're going to, have these things go and do whatever. It must create a sort of tension for you as a company, because what do? Do you kind of go with it then and just say, okay, right, now we're going to call everything we do agentic, or do you try and stand firm and have some sort of differentiator in that kind of race? Like, how do you think about it?
Yeah, great question. Very introspective. I mean, first of all, we sit at the application layer, and we've very much engineered the platform to be built like Legos in many ways. We give you the building blocks, and I feel from a strategic standpoint, and also like sort of from a philosophical standpoint, I have an opinion, And then, the team has an opinion. We have an opinion as a company on what's a good approach and what's maybe not so good approach to building these types of applications. But ultimately, we still leave room for customers to do what they'd like, which means if you want to build a pure LLM-driven, generative AI, text-driven, tool calling, whatever type of application, if you have a use case, because there are use cases like that have legs, you can. Now, if you're trying to do that, let's say, if we're in conversation with you and you as a customer are trying to go in a direction that we feel is not going to yield value or the value that you seek, we'll tell you. Ultimately, just like with Legos, you can build a shitty toy if you want to, right? Your creativity drives. It's not like Legos will put together the bricks and the rules on how you can connect them, and ultimately, whether they're going to build something that gets showcased at the Lego store in Flatiron, in New York, or at Legoland, or something that you'll keep hidden on a shelf at home. That's up to you, right? So we very much build the product. We pair it with thought leadership and guidance, but we also like to enable creative freedom, because it's happened more than once that customers surprised us when building with our platform with creative solutions that weren't necessarily they were by no means a misuse of the technology, but just they piece things together in ways that we haven't thought about. So I guess one thing that from a philosophical standpoint and a product, let's say, strategy standpoint, we don't want to prevent people from doing what they might want. So there's nothing at the application layer in the market today, no matter who puts it out, that the NLX platform cannot power. Nothing. Now, whether all of those use cases have practical legs or not, that I certainly don't think that's the case. But at the same time, I'm not the judge. I'm one person with an opinion, a strong opinion, obviously. But ultimately, I believe in sort of. I think one of humankind's superpowers and people in general, right? Their superpower is creativity. That's something that computers and, at least to the greatest extent of our knowledge, right? Like we're kind of like a unique literal animal that's really good at that. So I think suppressing that is wrong. So as I mentioned, we'll enable whatever you want to build, but we'll have an opinion about what's practical. I think that's important to offer that guidance to those who naturally might be receptive to receiving it, and it might sway their approach to building otherwise.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. And it's like, yeah, I have seen some very good use case. Well, in fact, there's lots of good arguments for LLMs throughout the conversational AI pipeline, many of which we've kind of touched on. It's the whole planning bit that I have a problem with. I don't understand yet, and I haven't come across a sufficient use case yet that would think that as an enterprise, I want to allow this thing to make up the business process. And a lot of what people call agentic today is really, and I actually think it's a pretty solid use case for how you might string together some LLMs, which is that you've got some tools that it has access to, and you describe what those tools are, when to use it, and what data is needed before trying to use it. You give the thing a role and a brief description of the process that it should follow and all that kind of thing. And so you've kind of solved the first problem of, this is your job, this is what you're trying to do, this is broadly speaking how you should do it, and these are the tools that you have access to. And then you've solved the problem of only use this tool at this point when you've got this information, and don't come here until you've used that tool first, or whatever it might be. And so essentially people might call that an agentic way, because you're not coding the rules, you're writing the rules in language, but you've still pretty much given it a box to sit within, and you've told it specifically what you want it to do, and when to do it, and pretty much how to do it. And then the space that's left, which is really where it can work some magic, is in the dialogue management. It's in, okay, you say something, it doesn't quite match what I'm looking for, but I'll contextually be able to have this conversation with you to help you arrive at a place where I can actually be helpful for you. And so I don't question that approach is actually fairly a sensible approach. I question how you monitor and quality assure that over time, and how you kind of guarantee that if 250,000 conversations are going to be had with this thing, that it kind of does the same thing all the time. That's kind of still a bit of a gap, but I don't question that approach. It's just the thing that I do question is the actual genuine definition of agency, which is the ability to set your own goals, plan your own tasks, and not do what you want, but like, make up the process. That's the bit that I kind of can't get on board with yet. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but it's the bit that I have an issue with.
I honestly, I'd have to agree with you, because ultimately you're not saying, and neither of us is saying that can't drive value. But I think I'll rephrase it in my own words, and I think you'll agree based on what you just said. I have a problem with people using that word and masking or ignoring the fact that rules-driven logic is still present, relevant, and quite necessary to make those work. Because even the best examples of agents out there, right? We're talking, again, kind of agent that can drive real value, not gimmicks. They're ultimately a playbook taken from a human expert. And then for the 5, 10, whatever, 24 steps that the human expert might do, you execute those with AI contextually, as opposed to just programming every little variation of that. Fantastic approach, can yield value, but still rules driven. Just because you're using AI in certain parts of it, it doesn't. Yeah, so I'd have to agree with you with what you just said there, because it's just true. And I think the bigger problem I have is that a lot of where agentic AI is used in the market is like, oh, if you call an LLM, boom, you have AI agents. Like, well, not quite.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, that's a problem. And also the whole kind of like selling old wine in new bottles, which is calling everything agentic, regardless of whether it uses large language models anyway. I saw something where, and a NLU-based chatbot is being called an agent because technically speaking, it sort of does things without people being involved with it. And I suppose to some degree you might give that some degree of agency because it's operating on its own. But it's just, it's a mad sort of place to be in. And I understand exactly where it comes from, because ultimately if the client is asking for agents and their use case doesn't require an agent or an agentic approach, but it would benefit from some generative AI somewhere, some large language model somewhere, or maybe not. But ultimately, if you tell them, yeah, fine, you're going to have an agent, and then you just build the right thing for them, regardless of whether you classify it as an agent or not, then is there a problem? I don't know. I don't know where I stand with that or not, but I think that's where it comes from.
I'm curious to pose something. Let's see. I'm curious to see if you'd agree. Can we say that in an application of this sort, you might have agentic functions. You might have specific parts of the overall, let's call it workflow, right? Or the conversational interaction that you're having. And some parts of that might be agentic in nature, because there's totally a way to kind of build that. But that doesn't necessarily mean the overall thing is agentic. Would you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I would probably agree with that. Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying that, for example, I don't know, let's say that you have I'm trying to think of a use case. Maybe a use case might be something like, let's say it's an internal tool used by a marketing team to come up with marketing campaigns and then deploy them into its email marketing solution. I know it's not a chatbot, but let's take that. So perhaps then there may be a degree of agency if you had a solution that did something like asked you a bunch of questions about what your goals are and who your target audience is, and then it maybe goes away and does a bit of research and then fleshes that out for you and tells you, actually, here's what we've learned from the research that we've done about your target audience. These are the things that we recommend you should focus on. There's a degree of agency in that, I suppose, because you haven't told it specifically where to go to look for the information. It's kind of gone and done it itself. It's also decided itself that we need to go and do some research to find out more information. So there's a degree of agency in that, I suppose. And then maybe you tell it what you want to go and do. So focus on this thing, and then maybe it goes and does some more stuff. But then ultimately you take that and you set up the email campaign, which is the programmatic kind of way of doing it. So that whole entire process perhaps would feature some agency, but maybe it's not an agentic full end-to-end process. Correct. Perhaps I don't know if that's a good example or not, but yeah.
No, I think that's a really good example, because ultimately I think that I think introduces a little bit more transparency around what's being positioned, because again, from a buyer's standpoint, most of them are not super well versed in what these technologies mean, and then they have a certain level of when they hear a certain term, just by the nature of how they're presented in the market, and then they get disappointed. It's like, well, I think if these sort of technologies were positioned a little bit more transparently, I think it would do the industry good to drive more ROI than maybe it does today.
Yeah, agreed. Definitely. One thing is for sure, though, it is really interesting to see, being at this for a long time, not as long as you, but as we've both been sort of in this industry for a little while. And, pre-2022, it was like, look, there's fucking loads of value over here. Look what you can do. You can kind of understand language and you can have conversations and it can be done without you being there and it can talk to 10,000 customers at the same time. It's brilliant. And it's kind of like, some companies got it and all that lot. And then 2022 came around and it's a little bit better now that there's more broad awareness and general acceptance in terms of like, we're quite happy really now with computers talking and having interactions with them. It's just really a degree of how you want to go about doing that. Do you want to have it a little bit more belt and braces and controlled, or do you want to have it a little bit more freeform and dynamic? So, but I think generally speaking, going back to where we started this conversation from when you were joining us on the podcast in 2023, that it was still kind of being figured out then. Whereas I think now, as you kind of alluded to, there's use cases that have been settled on for generative AI, things like classification and things like that, dialogue management and all that lot. So it's positive in that respect, would you agree, that like the general awareness and enthusiasm around conversational interfaces is now well and truly established?
100%. 100%. I think it's propulsed the industry to the forefront of just about everything else. It's, first of all, the recent innovations, right, make for a much more natural form of engagement with computers that was possible ever before. Super exciting. And yeah, this maturing that we're experiencing or will continue to experience, it's very natural. It's going to get everything closer to ROI. I think, well, there's the element like us, we see ROI all the time because we approach the way we approach, but then those that are reacting to the buzz are going to eventually learn the lesson. But I think eventually those lessons will be learned, and then it will calibrate the expectations of what's practical, and then because there's a lot that's practical. That's the exciting and frustrating part sometimes, based on like what you see in the market on that. It's like, no, there's so much that's practical, but when you're like distracted with the wrong things, then naturally you're not going to see the value that you otherwise would expect.
Definitely. Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. Right. Thank you so much, Andrei. This has been absolutely fantastic. I'm just checking the website here. It's NLX.ai, isn't it? If people want to go and check it out and learn a little bit more and have a poke around and figure out what's going down. NLX.ai. Thank you so much for joining us again. It's been absolutely fantastic. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Till next time. Hopefully less than 2 years from now.
Definitely less than 2 years. Yeah, I think we were supposed to be talking about voice today. We didn't even get there because we got so wrapped up and caught up in the whole agentic thing. So we definitely in the summer, before the summer even, let's get the next one in and let's do that focused on voice, because there's lots of exciting developments going on there. And there's actually a lot of stuff that NLX is doing in particular that I think is really, really cool. So we definitely want to pick that up for sure.
Sounds like a plan.
Nice one. Thank you so much. Thank you all for tuning in. Very much appreciated. And we'll see you on the next one. Bye now.